Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2nd Australian Division's last Tuesday of the month PME. I'm your host, Major Jeremy Barraclough. Tonight's topic is focused on scalability to provide insights on how Defence and the Division can be more ready with more mass and stamina. To guide us through this, we are fortunate to have Colonel Kidson as our navigator. Not only did she write the book ×3, she's also received a PhD in recognition for her academic studies, and also when she was instrumentalising scaling as CO of 5 Engineer Regiment during the bushfire response, she was awarded the Conspicuous Service Medal. So not one to rest on her laurels there. And I do recommend her second book to the audience of the 2nd Division, Scaling the Force, Reserve Mobilisation for Defence Contingencies, and her third publication, which has been released today, being Scalability Insights. So some quick notes before we start. This is part of the Cove series recorded on the 30th of April, and all information is deliberately presented at the unclassified or equivalent level. The views presented today are those of the individual representing them and not official positions of the Australian Army, Department of Defence or the Australian Government. Lastly, thanks to the program partners being the Cove, the Australian Army Research Centre and the Randwick Barracks Officers Mess. Without their support, we would not be able to contribute and deliver these presentations. So please do subscribe to their social media for more PME in your pocket. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for tonight's speaker, Colonel Renee Kidson, PhD, CSM. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, JB. Sir, ma'am, thanks also for joining us in the audience live, and a big hello to the folks at home and also our future friends that will watch this seminar after the event. Can you believe we've had this bit of a cold change in Sydney, so we've actually got the wood fire burner in here. Folks, if you rewind with me, 2 years ago in January 2022, two initially unconnected things happened, which then came together to form the genesis of this work. First, I received my posting order. Okay, rightio. Director Scalability, Army Headquarters, reporting to the G3. I go, oh, that's terrific. I'm going to really enjoy that. So I make an office call with the Army G3, sit down with him. Sir, I'm so happy to be here in this posting. Can you tell me about this scalability thing? This was 2 years ago. And in fairness, no one really in the defence portfolio had much of an idea of what scalability actually was at that time. Mind you, we've caught up big time since, and this seminar speaks to that point. But the thing about the ADF is we're fast learners. And so in that classic military tradition of if you think you've got a problem, create a directorate, it was a little bit like that. So as I'm going around the traps speaking to some senior officers asking their views on scalability, I realised that in my tenure I had to try and help my service to put its arms around this thing called scalability, to give it some shape. So I'd already made my mind up about that. The second thing that happened in January 2022, I was panelled for the Defence and Strategic Studies course. This is a 1-year master's program. It's held out at Western Creek, and it's for officers that might show potential of future promotion to brigadier. So anyway, I'm enrolled in the MBA program there. I'm out at Western Creek and I'm sitting through that first week of classes, and you need to select your MBA thesis topic. I'm going, oh, I've got to write a thesis. What am I going to write a thesis about? Light bulb moment. I've got to write my thesis on defence scalability because no one can actually tell me what it is. I went through the approval processes, and this is how this piece of work came to be. Folks, I'll aim to speak no more than half an hour because I'm way more interested in the Q&A session that we can have on this important topic. So let's crack open the slide pack and see where we go with this. As you're aware, the NDS was issued less than a fortnight ago, and everyone wants to know what types of capabilities should the ADF be investing in. Well, this slide, I hope you like quad charts, just gives you the answer. So I'd rather just give you the answer up front. This is what scalability tells us about our capability investments. The types of capabilities that you want are those with high scalability and high asymmetric impact. And the reason that you want to be in that top right quadrant is that's where you've got competitive advantage. You're going to be able to ramp things up. So scalability as a term has been used increasingly, not just within defence, but it's very broadly used in the corporate sector as well. And it expresses a, we presume, desirable attribute of a business process, a system or an organisation. You can use any of those three. But as soon as I delved into this, there was no agreed definitional clarity and no real conceptual basis, not just within defence, but when I looked globally in the international business literature. So the purpose of our work here was to develop an initial working definition of scalability that defence could use, and then to aid further doctrine development, org design, and to aid response within defence. So a seminar presentation in two parts. We'll do a little bit of sprinkling of theory, that's part one, and then we'll do a big dollop of practitioner guidance in part two, and let's have a look at what type of cake that bakes for us. Always good to start with some definitions. So the definition of scalability, the ability of the ADF to deliver acceptable performance internally and effects externally with fluctuation in existing or new demands. The other thing is, like everyone else, I kind of started my scalability journey thinking it was probably a technical problem, you know, easily solvable. As soon as I got into it, I appreciated that actually scalability is a socio-technical construct, and the socio bit really matters for an organisation such as ours. So bear with me. This scalability goal will make more sense to you by the end of the seminar. The goal of scaling is to achieve scale as you move your organisation through these state transitions, and we'll come to them. But what you're trying to do is preserve or improve other things that are really important about your organisation. That might be your performance, that might be your cost, your reliability, your security, or you might be trying to preserve your culture. So scaling is about that controlled growth while preserving important attributes. There was another implication we started to hit, not just in theory but in practice. Rapid scaling may require a trade-off between quality and quantity, and we'll speak to that towards the end of the slide pack when we talk about training time, but also a revised risk tolerance. And the thing that was inescapable as we delved into this is scalability leadership. We can't actually outsource the leadership aspect of scalability because it requires these trade-offs, which are ultimately leadership and command decision. Get asked this all the time, so again, better off to put it up front, aren't we? What's the difference between scalability and mobilisation? Are they the same thing? Is one a euphemism for the other? Well, not quite. If you go onto the DPN and you have a look at the definition that's just there on the DPN for strategic mobilisation, I'll just read it off for you. It's that process that generates military capabilities and marshals national resources to defend the nation and its interests. So if you think about it, strategic mobilisation, that's a pretty high threshold, okay? In scalability terms, it's a case of upscaling when you've got recourse to resources beyond those normally allocated to defence. You're probably drawing at this stage on the NSB, the National Support Base. And you can see here this graphic, we've got readiness, we've got preparedness, and then we've got mobilisation. Scalability spans that spectrum. So scalability relates to the ease and the mechanisms by which the ADF can move up and down this spectrum, not only scaling up but scaling down. Strategic mobilisation you might like to think of as one specific instance of this more general spectrum of scaling. It includes the full range of events below that quite extreme threshold of strategic mobilisation. The other thing that you'll notice is that both mobilisation and demobilisation, they are exceptional events in the life of a nation or the life of a company. Scaling tries to reframe the continuum of those processes as business as usual. So the challenge questions for you, and we're all doing this at different levels regardless of rank or what we do in our day job. How scalable is your business process, organisation or system? How would you go about measuring your scalability? And most importantly, can you improve your scalability? Another point to note from this slide is there's two modes of scalability. The first mode of scalability is in its design capacity. So scalability design, you're trying to design in scalability features in your organisation. If we have a think about that, that's a statement of potential. How scalable is my organisation? The military analogy is that's a planning function. That's the 5 cell. Compare that with scaling response. So that's when something's happened and we're just reacting to that thing. So that is a statement of performance, and that equates to the ops cell, obviously. If you're asked to design a scaling response, you need to know 3 metrics. Here they are. The first one is scaling factor, how much, expressed as a proportion of the original state. So are we doubling? Are we tripling? Is it something else? So you need to know that scaling factor first. The second one is the scaling rate. That's the time that you need to double that thing that you're doing. And finally, the scaling ratio. This is the shape parameter, and it's really important. What shape of scaled response are we after? Because if we don't keep a careful eye on this, our organisation will get out of shape as we go through a scaling episode. I spent a lot of time in the international business literature, read a lot of Harvard Business Review when I was researching scalability during my MBA, but there was one piece of really important theory that sprung out at me from the business literature. And if you take away only one thing, probably take away this, the theory of constraints, the TOC. So the TOC puts together 3 premises. So the first is, in any given business process, system, organisation, at that time, there's only ever one LIMFAC, limiting factor, that is binding the output or the outcomes. It's only one. Lots of limiting factors, but only one is the binding one. Theory of constraints says that any investment that you make anywhere else in the system that doesn't address that one binding LIMFAC is not going to make a jot of difference. That's where you need to focus your energies and your attention on that critical path. And then the other third premise that the theory of constraints makes is, as soon as you address that binding LIMFAC, the thing is it's dynamic, it's not static. So you know what happens? The LIMFAC then moves somewhere else, either in your organisation, and ultimately the LIMFAC might lie outside your organisation, which is important from the ADF perspective. Simple, sounds Captain Obvious, doesn't it? But actually we'll get a chance to apply this in practice. And I spoke earlier about the task of scalability leadership. So in essence, now that we know those 3 things about the theory of constraints, we can define the task of scalability leadership, and it is the ruthless pursuit, the find and fix of this sequence of binding LIMFACs that you are going to encounter as you attempt to scale in your organisation. A VCP, those of us in the Army, VCP has a very specific acronym meaning. I'm not talking about that one, I'm talking about a value creation process, VCP. Again, coming to you from the business literature. Scalability, you can either put your force employer hat on, or you can put your force provider hat on. Either hat will do. But in essence, we've got inputs and we've got outputs. So on the input side, to your enterprise, you've got your authority to act, you've got your human capital, you've got your financial capital, your physical capital, and your technology capital. All of those are inputs to your business, including if your business is defence. And then magic happens inside your enterprise. So we've got there, inside your enterprise, you've got some working capital. You've got your plant and equipment, you've got your workforce once they're trained and inducted, and you've got your intellectual property. So all of that goodness is inside your enterprise. And then magic happens inside your enterprise, you're creating value. Then spitting out from that, you've got your distribution and delivery, which is your products, your outcomes and your outputs, your delivery effects on the ground, so to speak. So scalability relates to the speed, the efficiency and the sustainability with which your organisation creates that value, moving from left to right. Conversion of those inputs into delivery effects. And for those of us in the military, delivery effects as experienced by stakeholders. If you had a business lens on this, it's the effects as experienced by your customers. But the higher the value creation process, the more complex that generally is, and the more difficult it is to scale. So we'll come back to that. So if you have a think about that, where do you think the first binding LIMFAC will be for defence? Is it on the input side? Is it on the working capital side? Is it on the output side? I'll leave that with you. Two types of scaling. First is horizontal scaling. You'll be able to guess what the second one is, won't you? So horizontal scaling, so this basically means you add or subtract laterally more units. Makes total sense because we're military people, we're very used to looking at our wire diagrams. For most organisations that scale, this is probably as far as they get actually. A horizontal scaling response is sufficient. And then we've got vertical scaling. So vertical scaling is different. This is when you need to change or activate your system architecture. So you might end up with structural redesign, or you might have a different control node and link setup or configuration. More difficult to achieve, but as we appreciate, again being military people, beyond a certain stage of lateral growth, if you don't go vertical, you're going to have a span of command or span of control issue. So again, we recognise that in scaling terms. First order scalability and then second order scalability, and then we can get on to some other bits and pieces. So as you can see, we're front loading the theory here, we're sprinkling that in so we can get to the practitioner guidance. So you see here three curves. The x-axis, so the horizontal axis, that's workload. So think about as workload increases, the vertical axis is organisational performance. So as the workload increases, how does the performance of my team go? For the majority of organisations, it's the blue curve. You'll start to plateau, so as you increase the workload, you'll reach sort of peak capacity of what your team's capable of dealing with, and anything else that comes in after that is sort of overflow, it can't be serviced. In some organisations, the hump actually starts to go down, and that is due to congestion effects. As you increase the workload even more, people are getting in the way of each other and your overall system performance is going down. But all of that is about a scaling response within your current resourcing footprint. So it's the organisation come as you are. That's what happens as you increase workload with scalability. What we're trying to achieve to get ahead of that curve is this. You, as a scalability leader, you are trying to orchestrate these state transitions, these little step changes where you can access or unlock more system performance. You don't flatline, you find a way of getting ahead of the curve. And to quote an example of that, there might be a manual process that involves filling out forms. We all do a lot of that, don't we? Now imagine if that form filling out is suddenly automated. That would be the equivalent of a step change, and every time you do that in your organisation, you're able to unlock more performance capability. So these state transitions unlock more performance as your workload increases. Okay, that's the theory, done and dusted. So let's get on now with the dollop of practitioner guidance. So scoping and framing, because again, if you think about you're in response mode now, how are we going to respond to this thing we've been asked to do? The 5 W's, why, what, where, when and who. Why are we scaling again? Always a good idea to be clear on that. Is this an internal driver that we're responding to or an external driver? What's the intention of this scaling episode? Again, also an important upfront question to ask. What are you scaling? Are you scaling new capability or are you scaling existing capability? Is it hardware or is it software? And again, you would recognise some of this terminology from concept APEX, so that's Integrated Campaigning for Deterrence. So it speaks of the human, technical and procedural aspects of a problem. Is it assets and infrastructure or is it people and processes? Finally, where? Is it a centralised or decentralised approach? Urgency, how fast, what's the scaling rate? How long do we need to sustain this scaling response? Can we get away with an expedient response or is this something that we need to build into a longer term? And finally, the stakeholders. Who are we aiming for here? Who is the target of our scaling? Who are our enabling personnel? Who are our sponsors? And very importantly for us, who are our commentators? Because everyone gets a say, don't they? So, for the MBA, I had the privilege of interviewing the supermarket giants. So I interviewed the senior supply chain manager for Coles and for Woolies to do a bit of a case study, because it had to be at an unclassified level, right? A case study of how the supermarket giants, the retail sector in this country, responded to the scaling challenge of COVID. And if you'll remember, we had toilet roll shortages, we had all kinds of bad stuff happening, so it was a very good topic for the case study. So I will share with you the goodness and the bottom line up front. The supermarkets kind of organically developed an emergent scaling strategy. This is what they did. They did a supply side thing and they did a demand side thing. And between those two, the demand and supply equation balanced out. So on the supply side, Coles and Woolies redirected current and they accessed latent capacity within their existing systems. Their structures, their facilities, their workforce and resources. They were able to contain their scaling response to first order. The second thing they did was on the demand side, and that's when they shaped the expectations of their customer base, folks like you and I, around, do you really need to take home 6 packets of toilet rolls today? How about we have 1 or 2 packet as a package limit? So on the demand side, communication with stakeholders to adjust expectations of the standard of service. And what Coles and Woolies did really well is they emphasised essential over discretionary, and particularly around quantities. So from this industry case study, we gleaned 5 insights, which we then used to generate 5 principles of scaling. And rather than taking you through all of that, I'm just going to show you the insights and the principles, so we can speed things up. So insight number 1 is that crisis, if it's within the resiliency range of your organisation, generally that's going to involve a first order response. In other words, come as you are. When you escalate from first to second order scalability, if you do that, it's kind of contingent on 2 things. The magnitude and the duration. How big is the contingency that you're responding to, and for how long do you need to sustain it? The larger both of those 2 factors are, the more likely you're going to have to go second order. And the lesson that we glean there is if you're going to go second order, do it while you can. Don't leave it too late. Insight number 2, capacity. Really important for the 2nd Australian Division because that's one of our secret sources, so to speak. So capacity is the key to first order scaling response. On all of us, there is an onus as leaders to understand our redirectable and our latent components. So redirectable is essentially full-time asset that you can stop doing what it's currently doing, redirect and point at a new target. That's redirectable. Latent is non-full-time capacity that you might be able to galvanise for that contingency. Workforce skill sets. There's a weird word on that page. You've probably already spotted it. Fungibility. What the hell is that? Fungibility means how transferable are your skill sets. That's what it means. And when we studied this, we found that the more transferable and generic your skill sets are, the easier it is to redirect that personnel asset. The problem, and you'll be jumping ahead of me here, the problem is what happens if the skill set is highly specialised, less easy to redirect, and that's a bit of a challenge. Latent capacity refers to both plant and equipment and workforce. When people think of scalability, they think mostly about the workforce bit, but there is also plant and equipment. I've got a cracker of an example from that COVID period for Coles and Woolies. So this is about changing the business rules can unlock more latent capability. So the example is this. You know, at Coles and Woolies, their supermarkets, they've got those enormous loading docks where the big trucks reverse in to unload the stores. Now, because most Coles and Woolies stores around the country are close to residential areas, there are council bylaws, etc., and the legalos on the line will know more about this than me. That means that the trucks can only do deliveries during set hours. This is business as usual, normal, everyday Australian life. Now, during COVID, as everyone knows, we had some major supply chain challenges and we couldn't keep up the supply of goods to stores. We were able to unlock more capacity because we went to the councils, the government did, and changed that rule, which meant that 24/7 deliveries were possible. Suddenly that enabled dual shifts. The same well drivers could double their delivery of trucks, and that was how we were able to keep the response within first order bounds. So this is a good example of change the business rule, and that can unlock latent capability. Capacity. Again, really important for the ADF, and I'm thinking in terms of CIRCAP model now. So first of all, you can see the goose egg. That's the absorptive capacity. And then within that goose egg, we've got the existing capability, 2 components, utilised and your latent, and all of that is your first order scalability. Beyond that, you need to augment your PERS resources or whatever resources, and that's second order scalability. So thinking about this now, the existing capacity, that blue bar, That's the JFIB, that's the joint force in being with our current scaling factor of 1. Yep, come as we are. The utilised capacity is CIRCAT 7. The latent capacity, which is the orange bit, that's CIRCATs 2 through 6. And finally, the augmented capacity would be if government directed us to grow beyond our current scaling factor of 1. First order scaling potential. So do you remember hospital ramping? Do you remember that? In fact, it's still going on, unfortunately. So again, on the x-axis, because we kind of like, as you're probably picking, quad charts. So on the horizontal axis, we've got our redirectable capacity. And that's when we think about our organisation, we go, okay, do we have low redirectable or high redirectable? And also here on the vertical axis, we've got our latent capacity. Have we got a lot of that or not much? Now, what we discovered about our hospital systems, public hospital systems during COVID is actually they're bottom left. They're low redirectable capacity and their low latent capacity. In fact, they were already at capacity pre-COVID and that situation did not improve. Part of the reason that Army became so involved in the COVID response is because Army, unlike many workforces, just so happens to be top right quadrant. Because we spend a lot of our time training, it's a pretty easy convenience to say, stop doing that task, we're going to redirect you to another task, just as we did during bushfires and COVID. So we have a high redirectable capacity, but we've also got a high latent capacity because we were able to activate the part-time force, CIRCATs 2 through 6. Insight number 3, bear with me, I'm trying to get through the 5 insights so we can get onto the Q&A. So insight number 3, business intelligence is a critical enabler to scaling. And so as I'm drilling into detail with the supermarket giants, I realised they were doing a couple of things. You know, your Flybuys card and your Everyday Rewards card. Okay, so we AI'd big time those 2 data sets to work out what customers needed, what they were buying, and importantly, what age bracket they were in. So at one stage, we had a situation with our pensioner friends whereby they couldn't get basic household groceries, and this was pre-delivery. So Coles and Woolies were using the Flybuys data to work out vulnerable sections of their customer base so that they could do home delivery of essentials. So that's one example of using data. The other one is sense makers. There were literally a handful of people in the head offices of both Coles and Woolies, and these people were at an absolute premium. They had knowledge of their business, they understood their business, not just one node and how that worked, but they understood how that node connected to the other nodes. So these people we labelled as sense makers, and they were worth their weight in gold, extremely valuable individuals. Insight number 4, the degree of segmentation in your workforce that really impacts scalability. And remember we mentioned earlier, have a think about your workforce. Are they generalist or are they specialist? If they're specialist, it's going to be a little bit tricky for you to ask those folks to redirect. So a first order scaling response, and remember that's when you're redirecting human resources within existing job segments, that's going to be limited by the transferability of their skills. A second order scaling response means that you're augmenting with additional staff. So what does that mean? You need to train them and you need to induct them, and the longer those processes are, the longer it's going to take for you to unlock that second order response. And we need to factor that in. So if you're thinking about workforce potential, let's think about the attributes of our workforce. Are the attributes much higher than a general job? What's the skill level we need in our workforce? And what's the induction requirements? Are they pretty low level or does it take a long time to induct our people? The higher those arrows are, the slower your scaling response is going to be. And I know this sounds Captain Obvious, but it's really quite helpful to expand this out and to drill down. So this is where we come to the implication that rapid scaling may require this trade-off between quality and quantity, and scaling leaders, you might need to revise your risk tolerance thresholds. Insight number 5, last one, and we'll get on to the principles. Distinguish your internal performance from your external effects. Redefine the value proposition and challenge paradigms. Those are levers that you can use during a scaling response. And what I mean by that is this, the supermarkets worked really hard on the demand side of the equation, not just servicing more supply. They worked really hard to get us, their customers, to revise downward our expectations. Is this reasonable? Do you really need 6 packets of spaghetti today? There's no penne, but how about some rigatone? How about we get into a mindset where we're able to tolerate a substitute product? A lot of psychological effort, remembering scalability is a socio-technical construct, a lot of psychological effort went into that, managing the demand side. And it's up to us now to think about what that means if we apply a defence lens to that. And insight number 5, scaling is a transformation opportunity. The inefficiencies, the things that you think are inefficient but add to your latent capacity, that is really incredibly valuable. So these things called business process accretion we discovered, and you probably know this. There's a process, you've got to fill out 3 forms and get 2 separate supervisor signatures. It probably started out as a very simple process and then sort of accumulated, and now the process is kind of really unwieldy. We've got quite a few of those in defence, and anyway, those BPAs, that business process accretion, they are prime suspects for these binding limb facts that we mentioned earlier. You've got to seize the opportunity of a scaling event, never waste a good emergency. I think those were words that Paul Keating, our former Prime Minister, used. Scaling design is an opportunity to streamline all those BPAs because you have to, and you have an imperative to. And scaling response is an obvious opportunity to accelerate and to embed that positive transformational change in your organisation. So now we'll apply it. So you're in defence. Your scalability insurance policy consists of these 3 things. Firstly, you need a scalability mindset in leadership. The ruthless pursuit, the find and fix of that sequence of binding limb facts. As soon as you solve one, it'll move somewhere else. You've got to keep chasing that. Number 2, built-in latent capacity. And the examples that we have are our workforce, our CIRCAT 2 through 6, our equipment that's fitted for but not with, and our basing. Of course, NDS, as we mentioned, only out less than a fortnight and has a big spiel on the importance of our northern bases. Standardising your internal business processes and your SOPs, again, that comes quite naturally, but the trick is to actually do it. And number 4, invest in an active business intelligence function. Those 4 items, that constitutes your scalability insurance policy. So if your scaling scenario, it wouldn't be the first time, is fight tonight or come as you are going to be at risk of disproportional scaling. Why? Because some things don't scale at the same rate as other things, and you can find your teeth to tail ratio getting somewhat out of whack. So you can overcome that by doing these 3 things. You've got to ruthlessly pursue that binding set of limb facts. We've spoken about that a lot. You need to identify and then amplify your critical enablers. And in each of your capability areas, you know what those are. Those are the things you've got to go after. Those are your catalysts. And then you need to calibrate your scaling response to the absorptive capacity of the environment around you. I'll quote an example from bushfires, and JB held up book number 2. Yep, so the example's actually quoted from there. So Omeo, a dreadfully fire-affected part right down the bottom there in Victoria. In the end, we as the ADF were throwing more force elements at poor little Omeo than that township had an ability to absorb. To the extent that in the first few days at least, not all ADF members were adequately tasked. So that's what I mean when I talk about the absorptive capacity of the environment that you're operating in. So you have to stay calibrated with that. And now the general principles of scaling. So we've got 5 of them, and you've heard them all, so hopefully this is just a reminder now. The first one is redirect your existing capacity from non-essential to essential. And that definition is contingent on what the nature of the crisis is. The one for bushfires was quite different from the one for COVID. Principle number 2, harness your latent capacity. So what you might think is business as usual inefficiency, that is your necessary redundancy when it comes to a scaling task. Principle number 3, there is this complexity, scalability trade-off. Simpler capabilities are much easier to scale. Principle number 4 is stay in shape. Unless you keep an eye on it, your scaling might become disproportional in terms of the shape of your organisation. And scaling principle number 5, scaling can be, if you seize it, a transformational opportunity. So what you want to do is embed and accelerate those positive aspects. Now you remember this right at the start. What capabilities does the ADF want? What should we buy? Top right, we all agree, sounds really easy, doesn't it? So let's have a slide where we talk about AMS, Australian Military Strategy. So let's apply this now. We've already mentioned concept APEX, so that's Integrated Campaigning for Deterrence. And of course we also have Aspire, which is the ADF theatre concept. In that latter one, so in Aspire, we articulate our theory of victory. And it's this little acronym here, FACI. That stands for Focus, Asymmetric, Cost, Imposition, FACI. So that's our theory of victory. That's how we're going to prevail. So let's think about that now in scaling terms. So while simpler capabilities are easier to scale, that was principle number 3, unless we can achieve FACI, that focus, asymmetric, cost, imposition, unless we can achieve that, it might be of limited use. So therefore, scaling in isolation, that doesn't hold primacy for the ADF. We're not scaling for scaling's sake. In the ADF context, the purpose of scaling is to sustain a competitive advantage long enough to prevail. And that's the top right box. So AMS, Australian Military Strategy, as you know, in recent decades has emphasised a high technology means to achieve FACI. There is a bit of a dilemma, folks, which I'll leave you with. More complex capabilities are more difficult to scale. So prima facie, if we have a think about it, the ADF has high first order scalability because we've spoke about having high redirectable and high latent capacity that we can throw at problems, but our second order scalability might be limited. So achieving coherence now, especially now that NDS and the revised IIP are issued, achieving coherence between our military strategy, our force design, and scalability as a supporting concept, that's going to be critical, a critical strategic consideration for defence. Implications for Army, just 3. We're almost there, folks, so hang in there. Number 1, force structure, Army force structure. Principle 4 says that scaling requires a disproportional increase in your critical enablers. Now for us, if we have a think about recruitment and training delivery. Secondly, Army's value creation process. If I put firstly the force provider, the raise, train, sustain hat on, how well do we understand our internal processes? Do we understand our latent capacity and how we can access that quickly? How well are we doing business intelligence? And our hope is that ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning, will assist us there with some of that business intelligence. And finally, Army modernisation. Scalability, as we discussed, is ultimately about scaling effects on the output side, not the inputs. Lots of people focus on the inputs. So actually, there are multiple ways we can achieve that scalability. You might be scaling your people, you might be scaling your technology, you might be scaling your regional relationships. That's all, JB and folks, and I'll be really happy to receive some questions.
We'll start off with Lieutenant Colonel Ben Delroy, and he offers his question, ma'am, is how can the reserve component of Army be best used to enable scalability? Horizontally, vertically, or a hybrid of both? And I'd add in one of my own observations in there as well, is that that reserve component that we're talking about is not necessarily just a latent, because depending on your perspective, from an Army view, it is latent. However, from the national view, for example, talking about our medical personnel, it's redirectable. It's a redirectable asset because we have to take it from the civilian health infrastructure in order to plug into the military health infrastructure.
Two-part response. The first would be an anecdote from the Second World War. And we're here at Randwick, so what occurred at Randwick Racecourse is probably instructive. Do you realise during the Second World War, Australia didn't actually run out of soldiers? We had enough soldiers, enough volunteers came forward. In the end, we ran out of something else. We ran out of industrial workers. So there was this manpower directorate, they were called, and they were down in Canberra, and they determined the priority, the order of march, our net personnel asset in the whole nation, how much of that was going to go to Army and how much of it was going to go to defence industry at the time, in particular munitions manufacture. So can you believe, and this is a true anecdote, there at Randwick Racecourse, literally just down the road from here, we had enlisted a whole bundle of new Army people, and we got to the stage and then we got the call from the Manpower Directorate in Canberra, and it's like, sorry guys, you're going to have to take the uniform off. We're demobilising you here on the racecourse because you're actually required to go into defence industry, and here are your riding instructions for that. So what I would say is, this is a nation, Australia, with a finite population and a finite workforce. And it would probably be arrogant for us to just immediately assume that the military would have the first priority. So if you think about, and strategic mobilisation, I know that's not the words that you use, but if we think about that as an extreme event, that requires a national mindset. We might not be the priority. So that's the first thing. And that especially impacts the part-time force, CIRCAT 3 through 5, because you might actually be more valuable to the nation in your day job. And I had a circumstance during COVID where, as CO5ER, what was deemed an essential worker were some of my sappers that were Woolies shelf stackers. And for that contingency, the most valuable use of that member's time was doing their day job, because it was so important to us that those supermarket shelves were stacked. So that is actually a true, both of those are true stories, not that I tell untrue stories. The second one is, it depends on whether you're scaling for numbers or for niches. So if you're scaling for numbers, it doesn't really matter what you do in your day job, because Army just needs to achieve a number. But if you're scaling for niches, your civilian skill sets might be the thing of value. So you've asked an excellent question. Do we go horizontal? Do we go vertical? Bouncing back at you, do we need to scale for numbers, or do we need to scale for niche capabilities in certain areas?
We've got another one on the line, ma'am, from Captain Malcolm. His question is if Army is needed to scale to support national mobilisation in the sense of a call out today in case of crisis, conflict or other contingency, what are the key limb factors that you might consider to be the most problematic? Or is it, as you've just said, that decision by something akin to that Manpower Directorate that would be prioritising industry versus defence? Or is it something else that would be a key limiting factor, or that binding factor as you described?
Within VCDF Group, there is a directorate called the Defence Mobilisation Directorate, and you can look them up on the DPN, they're there, and they do some excellent work. So I'm not part of that team, but your question would be so well placed, directed to that team. What I would say is, if we've looked at recent events, and I'm thinking about domestic circumstances that we've been in over the last 5 years, I think there's increasing recognition across the agencies of government that the JIATF model, so that's Joint Interagency Task Force, that's that acronym. So in other words, we shouldn't assume that the military would always lead. It's probably going to be joint and interagency, and that's where we would come into play there.
We've got another one on the phone here from Captain Nathaniel, who's always a great contributor to these debates. And his question essentially goes, is it a question of how much is needed, or is the limiting factor more about absorption, the absorption capacity of the organisation that needs to scale? Is there a sweet spot in there that commanders need to consider when we factor in scaling, or is it just one of those things that come down to risk on the day?
That's what leaders get paid the big dollars for, is to know your organisation, whether it's a section, whether it's a platoon, whether it's a regiment, whether it's a division, whether it's the nation. If you're leading it, that's your task, is to so closely know that you've got to be in it to understand it. And I think it is a leadership art form. It's what we pay our leaders to do, to know their organisation so well that they've got a sense of what their internal absorptive capacity is, where they need to augment, and also how fast is the external environment able to absorb what it is that they're putting down. It is that delicate balancing act, and that is the art of true scalability leadership. It's a fantastic question.
Major Nick Kaplan, I'm the SO2 Log Ops at Headquarters 2Div. My question is relating to our actual Order 1 scalability of the force in being, and in particular to Principle 2, and the BAU inefficiency basically equating to our latent capability. Noting that we've had essentially decades of pressure, both internal and external, to minimise that BAU inefficiency. So I'm thinking about, for example, the outsourcing of medical, distribution, catering, so on and so forth, all of these potential limiting factors. How do you think we balance justifying to essentially the paymasters that we require inefficiency in those capabilities to enable scaling, when historically the drive towards efficiency is won out?
So this is efficiency vice effectiveness. And of course, Australia's current economy is predicated on efficiency, which assumes business as usual with our supply chains. I think that the strategic calculus in terms of sovereign risk has shifted, and I think our strategic guidance documents, including the NDS, point very nicely to that. So if you're operating in a totally efficient, economic efficiency is your driver and you're just trying to optimise that thing, that's a just-in-time logistics supply mindset, including in your warehousing. We've clearly moved from just-in-time to just-in-case. That is building in a deliberate buffer or a deliberate set of redundancy. The other thing that we discovered when we drilled into this is there's two types of inefficiency, and again, good leadership is able to distinguish the two. One type is bad inefficiency. So this is the inefficiency, a bit like that forms example that I filled out, that does not add to your latent capacity. Good inefficiency is latent capacity. So if you look at something that at face value, you think that that's inefficient, but then you look at it and go, well, okay, yes, it's a part-time force. At face value, they look to be less efficient than some of my full-time force effects. But hang on, that's your latent capacity. So that is good inefficiency, which you should tolerate, because that's the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. What tolerating that good inefficiency is going to do is build your latent capacity to scale when you need to, and organisations like Army were demonstrably better at doing that bit. So I think that the leadership art form here is distinguishing good inefficiency from bad inefficiency, ruthlessly stamp out the bad inefficiency because that's just negative, but good inefficiency builds in your redundancy.
Historically, of course, that's been used as a measure for good or bad of the efficiency of military. Whereas I would argue that the tooth to tail ratio, if we focus too much on the tooth, what we're doing obviously is removing our latent capacity for scaling. So it's a question of how we can reframe that in terms of how we look at force design, acquisition and the like, so that we can rebalance that for the purpose of enabling the scaling.
No, well said. And not that I'm drawing any direct parallels, but you know, that was always that statement about our German friends during not just the First World War, but the Second World War as well. And that is fantastic tacticians, not very good strategists, in the sense that what's the point in having panzer divisions that can advance if your logistics supply chain is horse-drawn? What is going to be the limfac there, and how long is it going to be before that particular limfac is exposed? So again, scalability leadership encourages that end-to-end thought process, which joins the tooth to the tail. So no use having the teeth if you're not thinking about the tail, because to that tail, your ammunition resupply, 135 keeps the diggers alive. Unless that's part of the calculus, that limfac will be exposed very quickly.
We've got one final question from out online here, from Wing Commander Hossein. He says, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. His question goes to the resilience side of the equation. So how do we add more resilience to the scalability framework? So in his words, we may have to take a hit before we need to scale up. Are these separate activities that need to be managed separately, or should they be considered as a concurrent endeavour?
Well, I did quote Paul Keating earlier, didn't I, when I said never waste a good emergency. But what I would reflect on back at the talk is understanding the scaling imperative. Quite often leaders, they get to know their organisation and they know it well, and they know what's holding their organisation back. But if the circumstances aren't quite right to make that adjustment, they can't pursue it necessarily. Sometimes, so this is why it's important to not lose that principle 5, and that is when you've got a scaling event, try and frame it as a transformation opportunity, because you'll probably already have, as a leader, that set in your mind of things that you would love to do if only you could get the right attention or the right resources to do it. Sometimes that emergency is your chance. So this is about the art and the science of scalability, and I think that that's probably the best answer that I can offer.
Ma'am, thank you so much for delivering your presentation. You've definitely given us some thought. And again, I'd extend my thanks to the team at the Cove, the Army Research Centre and the Randwick Barracks Officers Mess, and indeed for all the audience here and online, because this is why we do it and you guys help us make it all happen. Please do engage with myself, with Colonel Kidson, and I thoroughly recommend that you do seek out her publication that has been released today on, as you see in the link on the screen there, Scalability Insights for Defence. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and thank Colonel Renee Kidson.